Taste Lecture is part of a wider discovery series that we've been hosting for CCLS. So my name is Charlotte Burton. I'm the school marketing manager. A lot of people have met me already if you've been in discovery series that we've been running since January. And these series have been a Taste Lectures throughout June. This is our last one actually, into the beginning of July, which is on our energy and climate change programme. So a taster lecture from our professors here today, which I will allow them to introduce themselves in a moment before we get started, which is a really interesting topic for us to listen to today. The session will run, we've got an hour slot for this with the idea that there'll be a taster lecture followed by some time for questions as well. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A function that we have here on Zoom below, and we will get to them either in the Q&A function, or if we think it's topical, we'll try and answer them as we go along. We ask that the questions that you ask today are not any admissions related questions, as we don't have an admissions representative here today. I can help with some student support related questions, but if we can keep the ques to the topic we have today, that always makes it really engaging with our professor we've got here. So please feel free throughout the session to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. If there are anything admissions related, I will put the email address in the chat here for the relevant team for you to get in touch with them. So I will offer our professors here an opportunity to introduce themselves before you get started. Who wants to go first?
James? I'll kick off. I'm James Dallas. I am the Executive Director of the Energy and Climate Change Law Institute. I've been with it pretty much from the start. I spent about 40 years in private practice. I qualified back in 1979, doing upstream oil and gas. The world has changed a lot, and here we are talking about climate change and hopefully the eventual demise of fossil fuel energy. Norah.
Yes, good morning. Welcome, everybody. My name is Norah Gallagher. I've been working with James. I was trying to figure it out this morning, James. Is it 7 years now?
Yep.
Since we set up the Energy Law Institute. But actually, I have been working at Queen Mary, or teaching at Queen Mary, since 2002. So that's just coming on 20 years now. And I think James is right. Things have fundamentally shifted, and a lot of the modules rotate around the whole concept of energy transition. And this module, Energy and Climate Change, that we're just going to give an overview of today, is quite an important module. It's future looking. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go into all of the details that we cover in the module, but it's just really to give you a flavor. So just so you know from the beginning what to expect, it really is just an overview of how James and I suppose, approach the teaching. We like to get student engagement, so we kind of teach a bit and then ask questions to really get you thinking about the impact on the energy sector. But actually, really, James, I suppose, the energy transition and climate change is impacting right across the board. So no matter where anybody ends up working, there are requirements and parts of this module that will be relevant for all sectors. And I think that definitely comes through in the matters that we touch on, James.
Yep, absolutely, Norah. Thank you very much. I mean, we chose to do an overview of this module because it does impact every single part of the sector. And so this will give you a sort of feel for how we teach and some of the overarching issues that you'll come across. The first slide just says, why is climate change law important? And unless one's been asleep for the last few years, you'll be well aware of the consequences of climate change on our weather patterns and the intense debates that have taken place about what that means for us all. At the top there, you've got a quote from President Obama: we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, and that's certainly the case, and the last generation who can do something about it. There is a real sense of urgency, and it's creating a dynamism in the sector, which we'll discuss. And indeed, if you do other modules, whether it's renewables or nuclear, you'll find that this narrative about climate change is ever present. when it first was being talked about, there was quite a lot of debate about whether the science was accurate. And of course, it was a lot of it speculation at that stage. Well, the August report in 2021 of the IPCC made it clear now that there is really no room for doubt. As they said, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And the steps that are needed to address this global problem will have an effect across all aspects of what we do. To get to a low carbon global economy will require enormous efforts, enormous amounts of money to be spent, big changes in technology. And we can
James,
clearly...
James, I would add in there that, yes, there's actually, even in the last 20 years, I used to ask, because obviously I was growing up when there was the ozone layer, and the whole of the ozone layer was problematic. But actually, I used to ask students, even just 10, 15 years ago, if they thought climate change, was an issue. And actually, the majority of them wouldn't have thought so. And that's something that has fundamentally changed. And I think you can see it even in aspects. I just come back from the US, which is why I'm a little bit jet lagged, but the SEC are considering imposing obligations on all companies that are registered there to comply, to be climate change compliant and have ESG steps and measures implemented. And I think that is a huge change, not obviously the Supreme Court decision in relation to the EPA's powers is a little bit disappointing, but it seems to me that other companies and the private sector.
It's all companies have a role to play, because it affects every aspect of what we do. So we can make a difference. We can change our diets. We can use our cars less. We can have our houses properly insulated. There are a number of things that we can do. But ultimately, the big changes that are needed will come through government policy and programs, and they will be implemented through the law, both public international law, treaties, international treaties, and domestic law, which will either encourage and provide incentives for certain steps and measures to be taken, or will prohibit things like burning of coal or failures to put in appropriate measures to control emissions. And then the courts and tribunals have a really important role in giving effect to those laws and leading those who may not wish to comply by the nose to ensure compliance. And we'll be talking later about some of the very interesting cases that are out there where courts are forcing governments to adopt measures that will make them compliant with their Paris Agreement obligations. So it's a very big topic. We look at the science. We've just discussed the fact that the science is now regarded as pretty unchallengeable, that we as humans are making a big difference to it. And we'll come back to that. We'll talk about the different stakeholders. It is an immensely complicated subject because it touches so many different countries, so many different communities, so many different industries, and in very different ways. Some may even benefit from the changes. The vast majority will not. But how they're affected and their capacities to deal with it differ very greatly. And that means finding solutions are that much more difficult. We'll look at the international treaties that have been developed to come up with solutions to climate change. We'll look at emissions trading schemes, which is using, if you like, market mechanisms to drive change. And we'll look at the actions we've just been talking about in disputes, look at finance and how that is being modified to encourage sustainable finance being directed towards the projects that need it. And also how IOCs, but also companies generally, are becoming affected by climate change and duties to report in relation to climate change, and how their actions might affect climate change. And if you want to understand just how dynamic the issue is, then you look at recent events which are unrelated, ostensibly, COVID-19, and now the very sad war in Ukraine. And they too will have very marked effects on the way in which we address climate change and the consequences of that. And that's something, again, which we'll talk about. We look at the outcome of COP26. So as you can see, we both look at what the law can do, what the problems are, we look at the science, but also we're looking at events as they unfold around the world and how they will impact it. So we'll have a quick look at the science.
James, just also, I suppose, to put into context, we also look at how, I suppose, traditional energy companies are also having to transition, I suppose, if you will, because they are also being impacted. And, you know, although the International Energy Agency has indicated by 2050 that actually the demand for power will not quite double, but almost double. Yeah. Although most countries are right now increasing their renewable capacity, there is actually still a gap. And of course, there is the intermittency problem with renewables. So within this module, we do look at how the climate change discussion and transition is impacting on, I suppose, energy companies.
Yeah, very much so. New technology all the time and new finance being directed to support that. And the intermittency of renewables as an aside, I saw that they're now looking at heating sand as a means of storage, because that will enable them to use renewables energy when it's produced, store it in heated sand and release that heat at a later stage when it's needed. So we're constantly looking at the impacts, and all of this, we're a commercial law institute, all of this is changing the nature of the transactions that are undertaken and who undertakes them. So we look a bit at the science, and just touching on the science, right at the beginning, we have a number of slides looking at the greenhouse effect. And of course, greenhouse effect it's a very good thing. Without it, if we had no atmosphere, nothing, if you like, shrouding our planet and keeping us warm and keeping some of the heat in, we'd be like the moon, which, does anybody know, you can put it in the chat if you know this, what the temperature on the moon is during the daytime and what it is at night. And there they have no atmosphere as we have. Well, the answer for those of you who don't know is that it would be 100 degrees centigrade during the day and minus 147 degrees centigrade, minus 187 degrees centigrade at night. So we look at it, and one of the things that is particularly interesting to me about the science of it is actually when you look at the numbers, the gases that are causing the problem, they're in very small proportions. Even CO2, which is by far the most prolific of the greenhouse gases, is only 0.03% of the atmosphere. We also talk, though, about the very important concept of stop, not flow. That is that all the greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere by humans, which are, if you like, increasing the temperature because there is more heat being kept in our atmosphere. The greenhouse gases are, it's not about the rate of flow this year, and if we can get the rate of flow down next year, then the problem will subside. The problem is everything that we're emitting now will stay in the atmosphere, maybe for tens of years, like methane, or maybe for thousands of years, which is certainly the case for part of CO2 and all the CFCs, the fluorinated gases that I mentioned there. So not only have we got to reach the target of net zero, which currently is internationally, the target is for most countries 2050, but we've got to do it quickly. If we delay in doing it, then the consequences will continue to last for years and years and years. And so 2030 is, again, an incredibly important date, and a lot of targets around the world are related to that. So it's a stock, not flow issue, i.e. it's cumulative. There's a lot more one could talk about. One of the things that I always feel is that the margins are so small too. You talk about an increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and it sounds trivial. But the reality is that I think the average temperature difference between us and the last ice age is only about 5 degrees centigrade. And of course, it is only an average, so there are places which are affected more significantly. Another area that we look at in the context of all of this, because it is a global problem, you need global solutions, and you need laws that are going to apply internationally and across all or most nations. And when you begin to think about it and compare the consequences for an individual country trying to legislate to deal with a problem versus the international arena, you realize that it's very, very different. You know, there is no elected government that runs the world. There's no legislative body which is created in order to make new laws. There's not really, outside of things like the ICJ, an effective court system, nor a police or other enforcement body there to ensure that the rules that are made under international treaties are enforced. And there is obviously the body of, for those who've done public international customary law, but again, by and large, I think it's fair to say that the principles that are continuing to evolve in that arena are too general to provide the kind of specificity that's needed to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. And there's, so it's very different legislating internationally. It's not like a sovereign country. Of course, sovereign countries have to implement their own laws very often in support of treaties, but that's rather different. And there's a very good description by Professor Verdansky about the challenge that this creates. And in effect, and we've seen this, and I'll come back to this, that there's a sort of conundrum. The more ambitious you are with the targets you might wish to set, in this case, for carbon abatement, the fewer states will sign up to it, the fewer will participate, and the less compliance you'll get. So you have this, what he describes as the effectiveness trilemma. And when we look at the international treaties, which we do, which started with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there were some which imposed or sought to impose from above strict limits on carbon emissions. And that gave rise to the Kyoto Protocol. But the reality was they didn't get enough people participating in Kyoto. I think it represented in the end something like 40% of emissions. And so then you go all the way through to, I hope, something that you will have heard of, the Paris Agreement in 2015, which took a very different approach. It didn't seek to impose emissions targets on countries. Rather, it got the parties to accept that there was a problem, a recognition that they needed to target at least 2 degrees increase below pre-industrial levels to keep the increase to under 2, with efforts to secure 1.5 degrees. But the only real obligations on parties were to come up with their own plans for reducing emissions. And those plans were to be reviewed every 5 years and were to be increasingly ambitious, but very, very loose, and no specific requirements on any countries. So this bottom-up approach, in which it was hoped that states would recognize the problem and agree to participate because they played a role in setting their own targets. And that's where we are today. But it's fair to say that the Paris limits aren't getting us there quite yet.
Yeah, and I would just point out, for students who maybe don't have a public international law background, I mean, obviously it's not required for this module, but I started actually as a public international lawyer over 20 years ago, back in 1998. And I suppose the dilemma that James has just identified, I mean, it's true with almost every treaty that's negotiated, not just in relation to climate change, but I think it's probably more focused in that particular problem, because each country comes, I suppose, with their own agenda. And, you know, as an example, you can see Australia, as a big natural resource country, has different concerns to maybe small, low-lying island nations and developing countries who haven't yet actually contributed much, if anything, towards the emissions that are currently in the atmosphere that are causing the increase in temperature. So you can see very different vested interests, you know, from the US to China, right across to small countries, well, like Ireland, which is predominantly actually a rural and agricultural based. So they're also looking at, well, you know, do we have to down tools on the farming front and stop producing dairy? Or in a way, then you have carbon leakage, because all we're going to do is, and it's starting at the moment, is importing greater amounts of meat and dairy from Brazil and New Zealand, which essentially just puts the problem somewhere else. So there is a huge amount of complicated issues that need to be addressed. James is right, in Kyoto, they tried to be much more ambitious, impose hard targets, but they only got 37 countries signing up. Just to give you an example, there's over 190 countries that signed up to Paris because it was softer, and even the language used in the treaty is more diplomatic in a way. It's kind of, you can see that it's softer and therefore more palatable to a wider number of states. In much the same way, I'm sure everybody's aware of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970. We have 191 countries because they all agree that nobody really wants to have a nuclear war. So if everybody's in agreement, you get global buy-in. If you don't, then you have the compliance and participation issue that James identified.
But Norah's point is absolutely right. You know, whilst everybody recognises the common problem, they're all affected differently, and they are, in a sense, competing with one another for trade. And so if you're, I mean, it's an issue that people have looked at in the UK. So we have very ambitious targets, which we may or may not meet, which we can discuss. But the fact is, it will push the cost of energy up in order to transition to a low carbon economy, at least in the short term. And if you're competing with other countries producing similar products who don't take the same sorts of steps and measures to reduce their carbon emissions, their energy component of the commodities and products they're producing will be that much lower, and they'll be more competitive. So, you know, countries are looking at that, and of course they're all in different states of development, and so there are those developing countries who say it's all very well, the developed world now telling us umbrella clauses. Where have we gone to now? We seem to have flipped. Well done. You've come back.
I'm not entirely sure what happened there. Sorry about that.
But so you've got countries in different stages of development, different technological and financial capacities. Some who will, you know, if you're landlocked, you're not going to be quite so concerned about rising sea levels as the small island developing states, who will be inundated and their populations will have to flee. So you've got all of that to reconcile. You might just flick through the next slide, because this is the other, you know, big issue, is reconciling all these very different positions. And the sheer complexity of reconciling those different positions is very difficult. In addition to the things that we've talked about, the differences between different states, you've also got issues between generations. There are some economists who would say that if we postpone taking the steps that are necessary to address climate change, we're not challenging the science, but if we leave it, the world will be much, much richer and all countries will be better placed to take the measures and steps necessary to adapt to the consequences of a warmer climate, and also taking the steps then to reduce CO2 emission. Now, that's really to impose the burden on future generations. So how do the courts make sure that future generations are properly represented? And indeed, what about biodiversity and the impact on other species? They too need to be represented. So it is an enormously complicated, if you flick onto the next one, again, these are just some of the different areas, but look at them on the top left, emitters and perpetrators. Well, as we said, there are some countries who've been emitting since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, so 1750-ish, and some who have hardly emitted at all. Equally, since we really got serious about it in 1992 and said there's a major problem, and we implemented the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have managed to double the amount of emissions in the system. So everything from 1750 through to 1990 or 1992 has been doubled between 1992 and today. So hugely complicated. Then we obviously, and very importantly, focus on the international legal framework, going back as far as the Stockholm Declaration in 1972, when I was leaving school, for those of you who are interested. And that was really the first time people began to recognize not climate change, but simply the enormous impact human consumption of raw materials and natural resources was having. And then you have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change just after the IPCC had been set up. We talked about Kyoto. Copenhagen was a failed attempt to, if you like, build on Kyoto with further strict limits on emissions. And then finally, Paris Agreement. And then you get to all the COP meetings. We just had COP26. These are the meetings of the parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was exactly that, but we would talk about that in much more detail. Then we also look at, and I'll just 30 seconds on this, we also look at examples of domestic legislation. Now, there are, around the world, different people are adopting different measures to address climate change, both mitigation of emissions and adaptation to the consequences of climate change, which are already being felt. And in the UK, there was a piece of legislation very early on in 2008, which has been used as a bit of a blueprint, which is why we examine it in quite a number of other countries. It was really the first of its kind. It set legally binding obligations. So there is a legally binding obligation on the Secretary of State to achieve net zero in the UK by 2050. And there is also a series of 5-year budgets, stepping stones to get to 2050. And those two are legally binding. There's an independent committee that reviews what the government is doing, comments on it, provides advice and assistance, but is also very critical if they fail to take the appropriate steps that will give rise to achieving the net zero in 2050 or the intermediate budgets. And it's just a very interesting piece of legislation, which, as I say, is used elsewhere.
It's a very important actually prototype, James. As I say, other countries are looking at it, and it was one of the ones that I think the first piece of legislation that, as you say, set net zero target for 2050. So quite progressive. So we use it not just because we're a UK-based university, but actually it is seen as being I suppose, a high point for ambitious legislation in regard to climate change.
Yeah, and underneath it, of course, there are thousands of bits of individual legislation, everything from car emissions through to and electric, tax incentives and provisions on housing and transport and so on. But it's all with a view to achieving net zero.
Yeah, very important. And then, of course, we have to look at, we can't ignore the fact that governments have to try and implement as best as possible. And I have here the carrot and the stick, because that's essentially how governments approach it. And how do you change behavior? And if you think of all of us, they're trying to change all of our behavior in how we use power and efficiency. And they're trying to do the same thing right across the board, from industry, as I say, to home, with the smart meters. Many of you would have a smart meter in your house. So things like feed-in tariffs, contract for differences, these have all been incredibly important market mechanisms which governments use to facilitate the energy transition. James already mentioned the Kyoto Protocol. That was where states actually agreed, although a small number of them, to try and use market mechanisms to push for corporations to take specific measures to reduce their emissions. And one of those mechanisms that's specifically referred to in Kyoto is the emissions trading schemes. And although the UK was the first country in the world to set up its own emissions trading schemes, the first international emissions trading schemes for carbon was actually within the EU, and I think was set up in, if I remember correctly, now 2005. So we look actually at the EU as a model. There are other countries that have and are continuing to set up emissions trading schemes. It is seen as being a very important part of that transition. We're really fortunate. We actually have a friend of mine who's an expert in the field of EU emissions trading scheme. In fact, she's an energy expert, Professor Silke Goldberg, but she has advised clients over the years on what the cap and trade. So they initially had to set out how much emissions they produced each year, and then they were given a cap, and then they had to reduce over time that cap. So that's how the EU emissions trading scheme works. And then also we look at green finance. Also, we're quite lucky. I started my life after I left Ireland working in Clifford Chance in their finance department. So we have a partner there, Claire Burgess, who was actually involved in the very first green bond issue, which I think, James, again, if I recall correctly, I think it was in 2013 with the European Investment Bank, and then the first private one was a couple of years, 2008, and the first private bond was in 2013. And then actually a huge and growing change, and very significant, and James mentioned this at the very beginning, we're seeing a huge shift in climate change disputes. Just to give a little bit of context to some of those issues that I just mentioned as to what actually green finance is, and there's no yet hard, because it's such a new market, it's only just over 10 years old. You can imagine that with the new market, when it's emerging, you have to have regulation put in, and I put up the term there, greenwashing. That's something also you may have come across. I think they're beginning to make movies about this now, James, how to prevent greenwashing. But you can see that there would be an incentive for companies to say something is green, even when it ultimately isn't. And a very interesting example that we discussed in class this year was, would the retrofit of a pharmaceutical plant, if you're trying to make it more efficient and have less emissions, could you market that as green? Would that be acceptable in the market? And again, there's mixed views on that as to what would qualify and take into account those environmental and social considerations in the definition of green finance. And we look specifically at the efforts being made in the EU, because they have gone further than other countries at the moment in trying to define what exactly would fall within an environmentally sustainable economic activity. So that calibration of definitions as what would fit in to that directive that they're working on. They have a draft at the moment on green finance. And of course, that ties back into what James mentioned, Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, where there's a subsection that specifically says all states must work together to make the finance move towards green projects. So that's a very important part, a very new part, and actually quite a dynamic, even within the last, this module is what, 3 years old now, James, even within the short period of time we've been running it, it's moved from green bonds to sustainable bonds, to index-linked bonds, to transition bonds, so that it's moving all the time.
Yeah, and and as I said before, our focus is commercial law, and it is very much changing the terms under which finance is provided and raising new problems. Norah mentioned greenwashing. What happens if you've raised money on the back of a promise to invest it in something which is regarded as sustainable and will reduce emissions, and then you don't spend the money on that, or you do spend the money on that and it's ineffective? What sanctions? And they're struggling with this, and what you're seeing is an evolution of thinking on an entirely new area. Yes, quite right, Charlotte, thank you.
I was just about to say, yes, I agree with Charlotte.
You won't stop us otherwise, we'll just keep.
Well, we're coming close to the end. Again, we do spend...
don't worry, carry on. It was just ignore my thing in the chat.
No, we entirely endorse it, absolutely. I mean, we do in class also, we will stop at irregular intervals and ask, either for examples from people's home jurisdictions. We get people to look at, as an example, their home jurisdictions' nationally determined contributions, which is the efforts that they have to make, which are meant to become increasingly ambitious under the Paris Agreement. So we do actually think it's probably more interesting for students in the class to have it interactive. But this is the last point that sorry, James.
Yeah, sorry. Well, no, I just think that's a really good point, because one of the things that you'll find is that, I think even though we've only been around for now coming up to 8 years, we've probably had 80 different countries represented, and therefore being able to tap in not only to our expertise, but equally to students from around the world whose experiences will be different, particularly on a topic like this, is absolutely fascinating, and I think greatly enhances the student experience.
No, I entirely agree. And back, I'll say I was a public international lawyer by training, but I have spent a significant amount of time looking at disputes. In fact, I sit as arbitrator, and in particular for commercial but also investment disputes. And one of the things that has been really of interest to me is to see the complete and utter change within a very short period of time in the types of disputes that are being taken related to climate change. And they range from cases taken against states, but also corporations. So you may have heard of the renewable energy cases, where Spain had made huge efforts to try and comply with its EU obligations to reduce its emissions by 20% and increase renewables by 2020. And then had offered favourable feed-in tariffs, then cancelled them after the global financial crisis, and there was I think now there's over 50 cases that have been filed, and some are still pending against Spain. But also there's quite a lot of activism in the area. So you're seeing, I have the Greenpeace up there, so non-governmental organisations, Agenda, Plan B, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, filing claims against governments around the world, saying that they are not taking sufficient action or measures to comply with or to meet their climate targets. And I would point out here, you may have heard, you may not, but one of the pivotal cases, one of the cases that is seen as being one of the most important disputes, was the Agenda, which, as I say, was an NGO that filed a case against Netherlands. It was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, which actually held the government to account and said, actually, the Dutch government, you have failed to take sufficient action. You are not on target to achieve your reductions in emissions. And they upheld the lower court decision, saying that they had not complied with Article 2 and Article 8 the European Convention on Human Rights. So a very interesting case that other NGOs and in fact, I suppose all governments around the world were looking at, because they realize that this is something that they may also face, and some governments have continued to face. That's what the one case that people do refer to a lot in relation to climate change. And of course, as a result, the Dutch government, to try and comply and meet its targets after this decision was handed down, made a declaration to say that it was closing all its coal power plants. And then as a direct result, what you're seeing here, I'll give an example in the next slide, are pending arbitrations that relate to what are called stranded assets. So both RWE, which is a German company, and Uniper, which is a Dutch company, had interests and owned and ran some of the coal power plants that the Dutch government had asked them to build in the mid-2000s. And you can see that they had obviously gone in, invested quite a significant amount of money, and projected to recoup, I suppose, all their investment over the 25 or 30-year period of the plant. So didn't really anticipate that they'd be shut down. So now they're looking for compensation from the Dutch government. And of course, you can see immediately that there are different views on those type of claims in relation to stranded assets. There are those who think, well, hang on, the Dutch government was actually just trying to meet its commitments and it shouldn't have to pay any compensation. On the other hand, the companies were only in the Netherlands because they had been requested after there was some gas supply issues from Germany into EU. So they wanted to have some energy security through coal power plants. So there's very different views and quite emotive, James, I would say, on either side of this debate.
Yes, and huge implications for the investment community, because as you say, if governments encourage investment and then withdraw without notice the incentives they've created, then it's not unreasonable for people to expect to be compensated. But the risk of too much compensation is that governments will be discouraged from changing the laws in a way that is necessary to meet the very challenging net zero targets that have been set. So they're really on the horns of a dilemma. And I mean, you mentioned the Spanish cases, and we've got two other very quick examples of, again, exogenous factors, external factors, which are having a very big impact on the response to climate change. So in that case, we had the financial crisis, the banking crisis of 2008, which in part was responsible for Spain being feeling that it couldn't continue to afford to support renewables with the very significant incentives that they'd created and wanting to withdraw them. We've also got slides here on, I don't know if you're ready to move, if you're happy to move on.
Yeah, just to give again a flavour, there are also individuals, so Torres Island, they're individuals from the Torres Island, but actually Torres Island are in Australia, so they're actually suing their own government for not meeting their compliance, and that's actually a human rights case. They've taken it to the Human Rights High Commissioner in Geneva. There's other cases being taken by the Duarte case is actually a whole lot of individuals around Europe, but in particular Portugal, taking the Portuguese government to and other states again under the European Convention on Human Rights. It's a pending case. All these cases are pending. None of them have reached decisions yet, but everybody's watching these cases to see what decisions will be made. And again, quite an unusual case. You have Mr. Lula in Peru taking a case against, again, you see RWE up there as defendant, for their part of their contribution towards the emissions which are adversely impacting the glacier in the island, or sorry, in the valley where he's from, in the Andes in Peru. And the court actually said, obviously RWE tried to have it dismissed and said it's too remote, we can't be held accountable. And they said, no, there's a case to answer here, and that is working its way through the German courts. So very diverse cases being filed. And if you have a look, I didn't mention, but if you have a look back at this on this particular website, it's divided the cases into North Americans in the US, where there's thousands of cases already, and then outside the US. You can find all details there. It's a very important website, but it really gives an idea as to what is actually going on. Again, there's a lot of debate, James, as to whether or not it is the most effective mechanism to prompt change these cases, and whether or not the courts should actually be saying it's the government's, you're remiss and you need to do more, or whether the government's, whether that's something the executive branch should do.
I think the judges are very worried about being invited to stray into matters of public policy, or policy that really should be driven by governments. But at the same time, it actually is playing a very important role, I think, in giving a voice to the man and woman in the street who's concerned about inactivity and a failure to address climate change. So yeah, but it is certainly a big tension there. Sorry, then this was just picking up on the point I made, that there are other things that have a very significant impact on the measures that are being taken. And one obviously was COVID-19. And we all saw, particularly, I mean, in the UK, suddenly there were no cars on the roads, no aeroplanes in the sky. There are amazing pictures on various websites from NASA and elsewhere of the clearing, or the clouds of emissions suddenly disappearing, and cities and mountain ranges being seen for the first time in ages. So it was a real breather for the planet, and significant reductions in emissions. But rather like 2008, and this is the fear, what we've seen is huge amounts of industrial activity and commercial activity to try and make up for lost time, and so emissions are on the rise again. The other thing that happened really with it was that COVID-19 took all the headlines at a time when climate change was assuming a very significant portion, if you like, of public attention, and suddenly that was all moved away. And of course, the priority was much more on the short-term health issues and well-being, and the financial imperatives of restoring economies. And of course, a lot of people said, well, we can combine the two, we can build back better, so the investments can be made in things that will make a real difference to the sustainability of the economy as well in environmental terms. And the other one just wanted to touch on.
Yeah, but with the COVID, James, I think also one of the things for me was how interesting was that for a change, there was almost like unanimous, all governments acted together, and they were trying to, and that I think is a good blueprint actually for the cooperation that's required to meet the challenges of climate change.
And there's, yes, because there's a real need for sharing technology and know-how, and that certainly took place throughout the sort of COVID period. Very early on, people like the IEA were producing very helpful reports on how strategies might be developed by governments to build back better. And then we just wanted to touch on the final thing. So again, to in a way demonstrate just how dynamic the area is, we have this awful war in Ukraine. And of course, that has led to all countries suddenly looking at the extent to which they have security of supply, which is so important, not only for health and well-being, but for the economy, and saying, well, can we rely upon other countries for our energy requirements? Now, at one level, that will accelerate the investment in renewables and new technologies. So Germany, for example, has said by 2035, they want 100% renewables. And if you look around the world, Europe is very, very heavily reliant upon Russia. So they are going to have to take a lot of measures very quickly to address that. But of course, it won't be just through renewables and new technologies. I'm afraid it has also led to a lot of people saying, well, you know, we're going to have to go back to burning coal for power and burning coal for power is one of the most significant contributors to climate change. So Italy is looking at possibly mothballing some of its coal plant. China and India are increasing coal use. The price of coal has gone through the roof again, despite the fact that at COP26, they talked about phasing down coal. Unfortunately, the events in Ukraine are making a big difference. It will also, I think, mean that people will look at nuclear again more keenly than they have done in the recent past, and possibly will get these small modular nuclear reactors. The thing that worries me about all of this is that, you know, there's a lot of new technology being relied upon: carbon capture and storage, small nuclear modules, and hydrogen, and all of them are in their relative infancy, and the clock is ticking. So look, that's an overview in spot on an hour.
Yeah. In fact, James, you're right. They're actually building, I think, the first small modular reactor in the UK, so as a test to see how, because it would address many of the issues of, you know, the one-off, very expensive cost overrun that we've seen in Flamanville and in fact in Hinkley Point C. So it'll be very interesting to see if that does, you know.
Flamanville is still, you know, started in 2006 and still hasn't been built. So, you know, when you hear people talk about 2030 as being very significant, keep that in your mind. It's not just 2050, and there is so much investment required, so much that is changing, and always the risk of external events blowing the ship off course. But it is a fascinating area. I hope you've got some flavour of it, and also the way in which Norah and I interact, and on other modules it's similar. Are there any questions?
We haven't had any in the chat. We've had a very quiet group, which is which I always think is because obviously they're so absorbed with what you're saying that they can't even possibly think of something to ask.
We bamboozled them with the science. I just while people are thinking of a question, I've just posted, James, details of our energy forum. So one of the things that we do try and do in the Energy and Climate Change Law Institute is to run, well, we run things like the Friday lecture series, we have the Clifford Chance annual lecture, but also we have a thing called the Energy Forum. The one this evening is actually on the impact on the energy sector of the war in Ukraine. James mentioned some of the issues, and the panel there is absolutely incredible. So it'd be very interesting to see what they have to say. They're very experienced energy lawyers.
Including a lawyer from the Ukraine, who's, I think, joining us from Kiev, and was a former student at CCLS.
Yeah, actually, there's a question there on arbitration, and yes, there are arbitrations, many arbitrations, both, as I say, the pending ones that you find there in relation to stranded assets. So they're actually filed at ICSID. That's the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. You can, Sanat, find here. So they will have details of arbitrations. As an example, Greenpeace has just filed an arbitration against Argentina for granting an offshore oil and gas concession, saying that's contrary to their Paris commitments. They're also pending cases. So what I'm expecting to see over the next 5 to 10 years is an increase in arbitration awards that directly impact climate actions taken by governments. Also, you'll probably see more of counterclaims. So where the governments are saying, okay, we may have taken action, but you also have contributed to or caused some environmental damage. And there have been cases, several cases actually, one in particular in relation to Ecuador, where the investor was partly successful in its claim for damages against the government for breaching its obligations under a bilateral investment treaty. But the investor had to pay also compensation to the state towards the cost of cleaning up where there had been, as an example, I think, leakage from an oil plant. So the type of arbitration cases relating to climate change are growing. The number of awards issued to date are small, but I think it's going to become a very significant area, which is why we include it in this module. So I would have a look at that database, climatecasechart.com, that I posted in the chat.
And in fact, also there's the energy and arbitration module as well. But for ours, we've increased it because of the scale of the issues. We've moved from a 15 credit module to a 30 credit module for next year. And that will give us more time to review these very interesting cases that are developing and on a growing basis.
Fantastic. Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. And it's great to have something that's actually happening this evening that might be of interest to participants as well. So thank you for that. Alsanes says thank you. So
thank you very much.
Great answer. So thank you both for your time. It's been interesting for me as well. I personally think it's probably one of the most interesting programs that we offer. So, and something that's obviously changing all the time with things that happen. So great for me to listen in as well. So thank you very much for your time. This will be recording will be circulated as well, and I'll also be sending it out to anyone that couldn't attend. So I'm sure there'll be stuff for people to catch up on, and we'll be sharing that as well.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you all very much for attending. I'm sorry it was at such a gallop, but it is a huge and fascinating topic, and sadly we could talk about it for hours. I hope we will see some of you, later.
Oh,
James, I think you just dropped your
James.
Yes, yeah, I do hope we get to meet some of you next year in the next academic year.
Absolutely.
And have a lovely summer in the meantime.
Lovely. Thank you very much, both. And thank you for joining. Bye-bye now.